I have just finished filming the Arcane video, which is why I look terrible, but I want to ask whether Arcane, or Piltover and Zorn, is a dystopia, and this is Willow. She's been locked outside all day because she's annoying when I film, but she is here to join us, and she's going to provide incredibly valuable commentary, aren't you? So I asked you guys if you thought that Arcane was like set in a dystopia, and 75% of you across the board said either it is, or that Zorn at least is a dystopia. And I get it. I do get why you feel that way. I do think, by the way, it has dystopian elements, but I couldn't quite get it across the line to say like it's a full-blown dystopia or it's a dystopian story. And I moved away from kind of calling it purely a dystopia. One, life is pretty terrible in Zorn. Okay, that's undebatable. Poverty, addiction, you know, strife, being wrought by drug lords, usually not hugely positive things in people's lives. And the government brutally repressed its citizens when they tried to rise up and demand better living conditions. That's the scene at the beginning of the series. And you can easily draw like parallels to the Hunger Games. You can be like, literally all of this happened in the Hunger Games, and that's clearly a dystopian story. How's this any different? Well, here's the thing. Here's why it's not dystopia, alright? I can't get past the fact that Piltover clearly demonstrates that it is capable of change from within, alright? It shows that it is capable of reform and recognizing its issues and addressing them from within the system. The whole ending of the series, when the council gets up and votes to let Zorn be independent, is them doing that. They're able to have like a real discussion about it. This is much more akin to like a society with some dysfunctional problems that will address them in time. It needs to talk about them a bit more, or they're still debating it, but you know, that doesn't make a dystopia. It's what makes kind of the whole ending with Jinx blowing up the tower a tragedy. It's because they had just gotten what they wanted. The society had just settled its issues, and of course everything's just gonna get worse now because they killed everyone. And that's the sort of Shakespearean tragedy to it, you know. I tried to pin down, you know, what actually makes a dystopia, and it's really hard, okay? Like, defining any genre is incredibly difficult. I just kept coming back to this feeling that dystopians are permeated by the sense of there is no coming back from this. We keep making these mistakes and this is where we're headed, and there's no reform. The only way to get out of it is revolution or total societal collapse, you know. And Zorn and Piltover don't have that, alright? They just don't. I couldn't think of another dystopian story where like they peacefully reform it from within. Even when you look at it definitionally on its most basic level, that it's a broken world, a broken society, its capacity to look at its issues and try to reform them is in one sense kind of like it being a functioning society, it being like the rest of the real world. It's not so much acting as a warning. Panem from the Hunger Games had to be overthrown. There was no reform from within. Big Brother is eternal. There's no stopping it. There's no reforming it. There's no collapse. It's going to continue like this forever. It's a cycle, and we're all trapped in it because we let it get this far, and it's horrible and it's awful. Never let us get to the position where it ends up like this, you know. But secondly, dystopia is a literary term. It's yeah, hello. It is a literary term, right? It is a term for a subgenre, but it's describing a thematic vehicle. It's describing a particular method of delivery of a type of theme and message. No, people are wrong when they tell you that it needs to be set in the future, it needs to be science fiction. It doesn't. It just needs to be clearly, you know, a warning sign for, hey, look where we're headed, don't let it get this far. If we have like a fantasy series where the wizards created giant magical bombs that explode in the shape of mushroom clouds, and they let them get out of hand, and they all went to war with one another and annihilated the entire world and created a dystopian society in the wake of it. Come on, like, that's clearly warning us about like nuclear weapons and stuff like that. The message is clear. It's still absolutely a warning. And like, yeah, technically you can look at any society that is broken. If you draw a line, you say, hey, this is what it means to be broken, where it has severe flaws and injustice and problems, and you can say this is a dystopia. But I feel like that robs it of any real meaning, because you look at Game of Thrones and it's incredibly unjust and awful, but it's not a dystopia. It's not a helpful description of the world. It doesn't let us know what the story is about, really. It's just not something that helps. And these terms that we use in literary circles, they're about helping us. They're about helping us define stories and describe stories and articulate stories. And so we don't use the term dystopia to describe just societies that have incredible issues, but can reform them or are just flawed societies. But what does broken mean? What does flawed mean, right? And that's why it also feels really weird to me when people say, hey, the United States is a dystopia, or North Korea is a dystopia, because these are, again, literary vehicles for meaning. And North Korea and the United States, they're not vessels for meaning. They're describing the real world. Almost inherently, dystopias exist in contrast to the real world. And that doesn't mean that, like, every part of the real world has to be worse than the thing you're describing in a dystopia. I can think of a number of stories, you know, Brave New World, even Hunger Games, that, technically speaking, there are places that are worse out there than the events described. It's the contrast in messaging that makes it a dystopia in many senses. In North Korea, you know, it's not a story written with intent. It's a tragedy of the real world. But, you know, we have other terms for things like that. We have dictatorships and failed states. At the same time, that doesn't mean that Arcane doesn't comment on the real world, that we can't take things away from it. It has a lot to say about power and technology and, you know, poverty. But that's not the same thing. You know, all stories have some meaning of some kind, but that doesn't, even if it's saying, like, hey, these things are wrong about society, that doesn't make it a dystopia. So the last thing that kind of came to mind is that a lot of people have brought up, you know, I asked, you know, what do you think a dystopia is this one? People said, you know, it's the appearance of the utopia, and Piltover looks like a utopia. It's wealthy and progress, and it's cool, right? It's beautiful. And I get where you're coming from. But that's not a requirement for a dystopia. It does not have to have the appearance of a utopia. And that is really a more recent trope, or actually it's quite an old trope, but it's something that at least newer readers tend to associate with the genre a lot more, you know, with things like The Giver and so on. In summary, the mere existence of injustice does not a dystopia make. However, it does have dystopian elements, all right? You know, it does have things in common with dystopias, and I think that was purposeful. It draws on, in many senses, the same fears and worries and concerns that we have in the modern day, as a lot of stories do. And so you can draw a lot of parallels between them, which is what I was doing in the previous video on Arcane. You can draw a lot of parallels about what these stories are saying about the real world, and you're going to find crossover between dystopian and just like generic science fiction or fantasy. Absolutely. And I think that's what we're seeing there. So that's my thoughts. Not dystopian, has dystopian elements. But again, genre, it's all fluid, right? Doesn't make sense. Things can be whatever we want them to be.